On the 2nd of October 1819, a vicar's orphan niece named Margaret Ashcombe was summoned to the study of Rothmere Hall, carrying a candle her aunt had told her not to bother lighting. The Verrill family held every advantage a name and a fortune could hold over a woman the village called simple. Everyone assumed she had been sent in only to lay the fire and would be dismissed within the minute. What the Duke asked her to do instead, sliding a letter written in a dead man's hand across his desk, would unravel a lie 19 years in the keeping. Margaret had spent 19 years perfecting the art of being overlooked. She swept the same floors, mended the same linens, and sat silent at the edge of every parlor, while her cousin Louisa was praised for accomplishments Margaret had, in truth, mastered years before her. Her aunt had built the household's peace on a single lie, repeated so often that even Margaret sometimes wondered whether the fever of her 7th year had truly taken something from her, until she remembered her father's voice, low and patient, teaching her the shape of French verbs by firelight before consumption took him. She had promised herself, at his grave, never to let anyone see what she still carried. That promise had held for 19 years. It was not going to hold in this room. The Duke of Rothmere was not a man given to asking twice, and he was certainly not a man given to asking a woman his own aunt by neighborhood had once described, at his own dinner table, as unable to read her own name. But his housekeeper, Mrs. Hale, had seen something the family had not. A girl bent over the estate ledgers on nights when she believed the house asleep, her lips moving over columns of figures too quickly for a woman merely pretending to check them. Julian Verrill did not believe in wasted words or wasted people. He had 41 letters in his dead father's hand, written in a language he had never learned, and a household of scholars and solicitors who had failed, one by one, to make sense of them. He had one page left to try. He set it before Margaret and said nothing else, watching her face instead of her hands. Margaret looked at the page for a long moment, long enough that she felt the old fear rise in her chest, the fear of her aunt's hand closing over her wrist at 12 years old. The fear of being sent from the only roof she had. Then she looked up at the Duke, who was watching her not with the pity the village reserved for her, nor the contempt her aunt wore like a second gown, but with something closer to patience, as though he already suspected what her family had spent 2 decades hiding. She read the first line aloud, quietly, in French, and watched the Duke go very still. Outside, the rain had not stopped. Inside that study, nothing was going to be the same again. Not for Margaret, not for the Duke, and not for the secret his father had carried to his grave, in a language only she, of everyone in that great house, could speak. The dining room at the Ashcombe house held its breath the way it always did when Louisa wished to be admired, and Margaret had learned 19 years ago that her place in that breath was silence. She sat at the foot of the table, mending a torn cuff in her lap beneath the cloth so her aunt would not see idle hands, while the visiting curate praised Louisa's needlework, and Louisa accepted the praise as though it were owed to her by birthright. Aunt Constance presided over the meal with the satisfied stillness of a woman who had built her comfort on the backs of other people's silence, her eyes moving to Margaret only to confirm that she had not spoken, had not been asked to speak, had not dared to reach for anything at the table that had not first been offered. Margaret kept her gaze on the thread. She had grown skilled at this particular kind of invisibility, at making her hands useful and her presence forgettable, because for 19 years, usefulness without presence had been the only shape of safety she was permitted. The candle at her elbow guttered once in a draught from the hall, and she thought, as she often did at that hour, of her father's voice reading psalms to her in French before the fever took him, before the world she had known at 7 years old closed over like water. She did not let the thought reach her face. Louisa was recounting, with theatrical distress, how a tradesman's wife had mistaken her for a governess that morning in the village, and the table laughed the laugh of people who agreed it was a fine joke, because a governess must, after all, be able to read, and everyone at that table knew precisely which cousin could not. Margaret's needle paused for the length of a breath. She resumed it. Outside the tall windows the October evening had gone the color of a bruise, and somewhere beyond the hedgerows the lamps of Rothmere Hall would already be lit, though she had no reason yet to think of that house at all. Her uncle, a mild man who managed nothing including his own household, refilled his glass and said nothing to correct his wife or his daughter, as he had said nothing for as long as Margaret could remember. It was not cruelty in him so much as absence, a permanent looking away that left the cruelty of others unchallenged, and Margaret had stopped, years ago, expecting him to look toward her instead. When the curate turned to her at last and asked, kindly enough, whether she enjoyed reading, Constance answered before Margaret's mouth had even opened, saying with practiced sorrow that poor Margaret had never been able to read a word since her fever as a child, that it was one of the great sadnesses of the family, and the curate's kind face rearranged itself into the particular pity Margaret had catalogued 1,000 times and no longer felt as a wound so much as a bruise pressed by a familiar thumb. She said nothing to contradict it. She never did. The lie was older than her ability to fight it, and it had teeth she had felt once, at 12, and never forgotten. The house went quiet past midnight the way it always did, the servants abed, her aunt's door closed, and this was when Margaret's true work began. She carried a single candle down to the small study off the kitchen passage where her uncle kept the estate's ledgers in a state of chaos he never had the patience to untangle, and she sat at his desk with the account books open before her, correcting columns he had transposed, reconciling figures the tradesmen's bills did not match, writing in a small, careful hand that no one in that house had ever been permitted to see her use in daylight. She had done this work for 6 years, quietly saving the family from the consequences of her uncle's carelessness, and she had never once been thanked for it, because thanks would have required someone to admit she had done it. The ledger this month showed a shortfall in the accounts with the miller that troubled her, and she worked the figures twice to be certain before writing the correction in the margin, the same way she had corrected 100 such errors before, in the same silence, by the same candle. This was the shape her literacy had been forced into, useful only when unseen, dangerous the moment it was witnessed. She thought sometimes, in these hours, of the woman she might have become if her father had lived, if the fever that took him had spared him another decade, if she had been permitted a governess and a season and a name that people said with respect, rather than the soft, embarrassed correction people used for a poor relation who could not, so everyone believed, even read her own letters. She did not allow herself to think about it long. The ledger did not correct itself, and morning would come whether or not she had made peace with her life before it did. When she had finished, she blew out the candle and sat a moment in the dark, listening to the house settle around her, and permitted herself the small luxury of resentment before folding it away with the same practiced hand she used on everything else that could not be spoken aloud. She had learned to carry 2 selves through that house, the mute, slow one her aunt had built for public consumption, and the quick, exact one that balanced the books and answered correspondence in her uncle's name, and had once, at 12 years old, made the mistake of letting itself be seen. She still remembered her aunt's hand closing over her wrist that day, the psalm book snatched from her lap, the low, furious voice promising that if anyone ever learned what Margaret could do, she would be put out of the house with nothing, and no family in the county would take in a girl who had been raised a liar. She had believed it. She still believed it, most days. The candle smoke rose thin into the dark, and Margaret climbed the servant's stair to her small room with the ledger's corrections drying in the account book below, invisible proof of a mind the household had agreed, collectively and for 19 years, did not exist. At Rothmere Hall, the morning arrived the same way every morning had arrived since the old Duke's death 18 months before, with Julian Varell already at his father's desk before the household had properly woken, a stack of Steward's reports before him, and a cold cup of coffee going colder at his elbow. He had inherited a dukedom in worse order than anyone outside the estate's solicitors knew, tenant farms behind on improvements his father had promised and never funded, accounts that told 2 different stories depending on which steward had kept them that year, and a staff that had grown accustomed, under the old Duke's long indifference, to managing itself. Julian had spent 18 months correcting all of it, with a discipline that left no room for the grief he had not yet permitted himself to feel properly, and the household had learned quickly that the new Duke's coldness was not cruelty so much as a man holding himself together by main force. He questioned every figure, he dismissed a steward who could not account for a missing sum. He was, by the reckoning of Fenwick Cross, exacting to the point of severity, and by his own private reckoning, he was simply a man trying not to think too closely about a father he had loved without ever having understood him. Mrs. Hale found him there that morning with the tenant reports and waited, as she always did, for him to notice her before she spoke, because Julian disliked being addressed before he had finished a line of figures. When he looked up, she told him plainly, in the unadorned manner he preferred, that the Ashcombe girl sent over to help catalog the old parish records had been seen reading correspondence at a pace no illiterate woman could manage, and that this was the 2nd time she had seen it. Julian's first instinct was to dismiss it as the kind of servants' talk that circulated through great houses in the absence of better entertainment, and he said as much, not unkindly, returning his attention to the tenant report before him. But Mrs. Hale did not withdraw immediately, and something in her stillness made him look up again. She had been housekeeper at Rothmere for 11 years, she reminded him, and she did not carry tales she had not confirmed with her own eyes twice over. Julian set down his pen. He did not entirely believe the girl could read, whoever she was, some poor relation of the Ashcombs he had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with at county gatherings, plain and silent and entirely unremarkable in his memory. But he filed the report away in the part of his mind that filed away every inconsistency in his father's disordered estate, because inconsistencies, in his experience, were rarely nothing. That afternoon, alone in the study with the door closed against the household, Julian unlocked the drawer of his father's old desk that he had avoided for the better part of a year and drew out the bundle of letters he had found there, shortly after the funeral, and never properly examined. 41 letters, he had counted them once and never again, tied with a faded ribbon and written in a hand he recognized as his father's, but in a language he had only middling command of. French learned reluctantly at school and never practiced since. He untied the ribbon now and spread the letters across the desk in what he hoped was their proper order, dates in the corners in his father's cramped hand, and began working through them with the slow frustration of a man reading a language he only half possessed. The name recurred on nearly every page, Cecile Duval. He could make out enough to know his father had written to this woman for years, the dates spanning what looked to be more than a decade, and that the tone of the letters shifted as the years passed, formal and measured in the earliest ones, warmer in the middle years, and in the last handful before they stopped entirely, agitated in a way that unsettled him even without full comprehension. The handwriting pressed harder into the page, lines crossed out and rewritten. He thought of his father as he had known him, distant, correct, a man who had never once raised his voice in Julian's hearing and had never, so far as Julian knew, given anyone reason to think him capable of the kind of feeling these later letters seemed to contain. It did not fit the father he remembered, and that alone made him want answers more than the words themselves did. Near the bottom of the stack he found a letter torn at one corner, the tear old and deliberate rather than accidental, as though someone had removed a portion of the page rather than let it be read whole, and in what remained he could make out Cecile Duval's name beside another name, shorter, that might have belonged to a child, though the tear had taken the context that would have told him so for certain. He sat with that torn page a long while, turning it in the candlelight, his schoolboy French entirely inadequate to the task in front of him, and understood, with the particular frustration of a man used to solving every problem the estate presented him, that this was a problem his own competence could not touch. He needed someone who read French as easily as English, and Price had already written to every tutor and clergyman in 3 counties without success. Julian retied the ribbon around the letters, more carefully than before, and did not put them back in the drawer. The footman who came to the Ashcombe house did not ask for Mrs. Ashcombe. He asked, standing very straight in the front hall with his hat under his arm, for Miss Margaret Ashcombe, by name, on the direct instruction of His Grace the Duke of Rothmere. Constance stepped forward at once, smiling the smile she wore for tradesmen and callers, and said there must be some confusion, that Margaret was occupied with household matters and unfit to receive visitors of consequence. The footman did not move. His instructions, he repeated, were to bring Miss Ashcombe to Rothmere Hall that same morning, and he had been told plainly that no substitute would answer. Louisa, coming down the stairs in her morning gown, laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, and asked what possible use the Duke could have for someone who could not read a word set before her. The footman said only that those were his instructions. Constance's smile did not leave her face, but something behind her eyes went still and calculating, the particular stillness of a woman recalculating a position she had believed secure. She told the footman that Margaret was needed here, that the household could not spare her, that surely His Grace would understand the inconvenience of losing a servant of all work on short notice. It was the wrong word, and she seemed to know it the moment it left her mouth. Servant, spoken in front of a man who would carry it back to Rothmere Hall exactly as said. The footman's expression did not change, but he wrote nothing down and needed to write nothing down, he would remember. From the landing above, unseen by anyone in the hall, Margaret stood with one hand on the banister and listened to her name being fought over, as though she were a disputed piece of furniture, rather than a person capable of walking down the stairs herself. She had spent 19 years learning to make herself small in rooms exactly like this one, and some old instinct told her to go on being small now, to let the argument resolve itself without her, to wait until she was told what to do. But beneath that instinct, faint and unfamiliar, was another feeling entirely, and it took her a moment to name it because she had felt it so rarely. She wanted to go, not because she understood why the Duke of Rothmere had sent for her, but because for the first time and longer than she could easily remember, someone outside this house had asked for her by her own name. Constance relented only because the footman made it plain he would not leave without an answer to carry back, and because a crowd of morning callers had begun to gather at the gate, drawn by the sight of a ducal carriage standing in the lane. She could not afford, not with her own reputation so recently under strain, to be seen refusing a summons from Rothmere Hall in front of half the village. Margaret was sent up to change into her second-best dress, the gray wool with the mended cuff, and Constance came to the door of her small room while she dressed, not to help but to instruct. She was to say nothing of her own accord. She was to answer only what was asked and volunteer nothing. She was to remember, above all, that whatever foolish rumor had reached Rothmere Hall about her reading, she was to deny it plainly and without hesitation, because the alternative, Constance said, her voice dropping low and hard, was worse for both of them than Margaret could imagine. Margaret said yes, Aunt, as she always said yes, and did not ask what the alternative was, because some part of her had always known without being told, the way a person knows the shape of a room in the dark. The carriage ride to Rothmere Hall took less than 20 minutes, but Margaret spent every one of them with her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the hedgerows pass and trying to master an unfamiliar heat rising in her chest that she eventually recognized as fear, mixed with something closer to hope, an equally dangerous combination. She assumed, because it was the only explanation that made any sense to her, that she was being sent to scrub floors or mend linens, that some understaffed corner of the great house had need of hands willing to work without complaint, and that Constance had simply not wished to say so plainly in front of the footman. It did not occur to her, could not yet occur to her, that a duke might have sent his own carriage and his own liveried man to fetch a woman for any reason connected to her mind rather than her hands. When the carriage passed through Rothmere's gates and the house came into full view for the first time, gray stone rising against a pale sky, more windows than she could count reflecting the morning light back at her, Margaret pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the carriage door and made herself breathe slowly, the way her father had once taught her to do before reciting her lessons, though she had not thought of that particular lesson in years. Julian did not summon Constance to discuss terms, and he did not go to the Ashcombe house, and both omissions were deliberate. He had Price draft a simple letter of engagement the same afternoon Margaret proved herself over the single page in his study, naming a weekly sum for her services as translator, payable directly to Miss Margaret Ashcombe and to no other member of her household, with the carriage to collect and return her each day she was needed. He handed it to her himself rather than sending it by a clerk, and watched her read it through twice before she looked up at him, and he understood from her expression that she had grasped at once what he had done, not merely offered her paid work, but placed the payment beyond her aunt's reach entirely, a small and precisely aimed act that would ripple through that household in ways he intended and several he likely did not fully foresee. Margaret's hand shook slightly as she signed her name at the bottom, her own name, in her own hand, on a document that made her, for the first time in her adult life, someone with an income Constance could not intercept. She did not thank him extravagantly, only said that she would do the work carefully, and Julian found he preferred that restraint to gratitude he would have found difficult to receive gracefully. The study became, over the following days, a room organized around the 41 letters, laid out chronologically on the long table by the window where the light was best, and Margaret worked through them in order, translating aloud while a clerk took down her words, then reviewing the transcription against the original before moving to the next. The earliest letters, dated some 11 years past, were formal to the point of stiffness. An older man's careful French addressed to a Frenchwoman named Cécile Duval regarding an arrangement of financial support, its terms precise, its tone entirely businesslike, the correspondence of two people who did not yet trust each other with anything softer than commerce. Julian sat through many of these sessions himself, ostensibly reviewing estate papers at the same table, though Margaret noticed he read very little of what lay in front of him, and listened to nearly everything she said. By the sixth letter, the formality had begun to thaw, small courtesies giving way to longer passages. Edmund Varell writing of a garden he had seen in Bath and thought Cecile would admire, of a book of poems he was sending under separate cover, of his hope that she was in good health and wanted for nothing. Margaret read these lines in a level voice, professionally detached, though she felt Julian's attention sharpen each time the tone shifted further from business into something that might, in another man's letters, have been called tenderness. It was the ninth letter that first mentioned a birth, oblique at first, Edmund writing that he was glad to hear mother and child both continued well, and Julian's pen stopped moving entirely against the page in front of him. Margaret paused, uncertain whether to continue, and he told her, quietly, to go on. The letters across the next several years grew warmer still, Edmund arranging schooling, then a small house outside Rouen, then a French governess of good character, all of it paid for and never once mentioned by name in any ledger Julian had ever seen at Rothmere. Money that must have moved through some private channel his father had kept entirely separate from the estate's own accounts. The child's name, when it finally appeared whole and not torn away as it had been on the fragment Julian found weeks before, was Aimée, and Margaret read it and then said it again softly, aloud, Aimée, as though testing whether the name deserved more weight spoken twice. Julian sat back from the table and pressed one hand briefly against his eyes, and Margaret, watching him without seeming to watch him, understood that she was witnessing a man's inheritance rearranging itself in real time, a father he had believed he understood becoming, letter by letter, someone he had never actually known. He asked her, when she had finished for the day, whether the letters said what had become of the girl, whether she was still living, whether his father had ever intended to acknowledge her, and Margaret had to tell him honestly that she did not yet know, that there were still more than a dozen letters unread, and that the most recent ones in the stack, dated only 18 months before his father's death, simply stopped, mid-thought, mid-sentence in one case, with no letter following to explain why an 11-year correspondence had gone suddenly and permanently silent, and Julian told her, in a voice gone very quiet, that she was to find out why before she did anything else. Word came to Fenwick Cross before the leaves had fully turned, carried first by the miller's wife and then by every caller who crossed the Ashcombe threshold that fortnight, that the Duke of Rothmere had engaged Margaret Ashcombe to render his father's private papers, and that a Rothmere carriage now collected her each working morning and returned her each evening past dusk. Constance heard the whispers in the shop doorway and at the church gate, phrased as admiration and landing as accusation, for a woman who had told the village for 19 years that her niece could not read a single line was now expected to explain how that niece had come to be trusted with a duke's French correspondence. She resolved on a dinner, small and carefully assembled, to set the story right before it could set itself wrong, inviting the curate and the miller's family, and sending word to Rothmere Hall that the family would be honored by his grace's presence, should his business bring him to collect the latest pages in person. Julian came. He had dictated a note of polite refusal that morning, but some contrariness in him wanted to see the room that had shaped Margaret's understanding of her own worth, wanted to watch how they spoke to her when they believed a guest's presence obliged them to perform kindness rather than feel it. The table was laid with the good china, not quite matching, and Margaret sat where she always sat, at the foot nearest the sideboard, from where she could rise without disturbing anyone to fetch what was needed. Louisa wore her blue silk and positioned herself at Julian's right hand with the ease of a woman who had rehearsed the arrangement in a looking-glass, and for the first half hour she performed charm with real skill, asking after the drainage of the home farm and the condition of the roads, subjects chosen, Margaret understood, because they were subjects a duke might wish to discuss. It was over the second remove, when the conversation slackened into the comfortable silence of people who have eaten well, that Louisa turned her attention down the table, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry without seeming to try. She asked Margaret, with the particular sweetness she reserved for cruelty performed before witnesses, whether she found the writing at Rothmere difficult, given that she had always struggled so terribly with her letters as a girl, and whether his grace had been informed of that history before he engaged her, since it seemed only fair that a man of his position should know precisely what he was employing. The curate laughed, assuming it a family joke of long standing, and Constance's mouth curved into the smile she used when she wished a subject closed without appearing to close it, and Margaret, who had absorbed 1,000 such remarks across 19 years without lifting her eyes from her plate, did exactly that now, folding her hands in her lap and saying nothing, because saying nothing had always been safer than saying the truth in this house. Julian did not raise his voice, and that was what made it unbearable to watch. He set down his glass with the unhurried precision of a man accustomed to being obeyed rather than argued with, and he looked at Louisa the way he might look at a column of figures that failed to balance, with a mild, exacting attention that offered no warmth to hide behind. He said he was surprised to hear Miss Margaret described as struggling with her letters, since she had spent the better part of a fortnight rendering his late father's private French correspondence with a precision his own solicitor had failed to produce in 3 months of searching the county for a competent hand, and that he had come to rely on her judgment in matters he considered a good deal more delicate than dinner conversation. He did not say it as a rebuke. He said it as a correction of fact, the way he might correct a mistaken date or a mistaken sum, and the flatness of it was what emptied the room of air. Louisa's charm, so carefully maintained through the drainage of the home farm and the condition of the roads, collapsed at once into a stiff, high color that no composure could talk down, and she said nothing further for the remainder of the meal, occupying herself instead with a piece of bread she did not eat. The curate looked between them with the dawning discomfort of a man who has laughed at the wrong moment and cannot unlaugh it. Constance recovered fastest, as she always did, steering the talk toward the weather with the brittle competence of a woman salvaging a shipwreck one plank at a time. But Margaret, sitting very still at the foot of the table, understood that something had shifted permanently in the room, that a man of Julian's rank had just told her own family, in front of witnesses, that her word and her work carried more weight than their 19 years of insisting otherwise. She did not smile. She did not trust herself to. When the evening finally broke apart into leave-takings and the fetching of cloaks, Constance caught her by the elbow in the narrow passage outside the dining room, out of Julian's hearing, her fingers closing with a pressure that left no doubt of the feeling behind it. Her voice, when it came, was pitched low and even, more frightening for its calm than any shout could have been. She told Margaret she would go to the Duke herself, before Margaret found the courage to say a single word of her own history, and that she would tell him whatever was necessary to protect the family's name, true or otherwise, and that a duke's good opinion of a penniless girl was a fragile thing, easily undone by the right story told by the right person at the right moment. Margaret stood in the passage after her aunt had gone, her heart beating hard against her ribs, weighing which of them would reach Julian first. The name that sent them out of Rothmere Hall belonged to a steward called Aldous Finch, retired these past 4 years to a cottage on the estate's far edge, mentioned twice in the letters as the man who had once carried messages between Edmund Verrill and Cecile Duval when neither trusted the ordinary post. Julian ordered the carriage himself, and when Margaret assumed she would follow separately with a maid for propriety's sake, he told her flatly that the journey required someone who could read Finch's own correspondence, should any survive, and that he had no patience left for arrangements designed around what people might say rather than what needed doing. They left Rothmere at mid-morning under a sky the color of pewter, the road narrowing past the home farm into a track better suited to carts than a ducal carriage, and Margaret watched the hedgerows thin and the land rise toward the cottage with a nod of anticipation she did not examine too closely. Finch received them stiffly, an old man made suspicious by long habit of secrecy, but he warmed once Julian named his father plainly, and once Margaret, at Julian's nod, produced 2 of the translated letters as proof of the trust placed in her. What Finch told them, haltingly and with long pauses to gather his nerve, was that Cecile Duval had lived in this very cottage for the better part of a year, brought here quietly from Rouen with her infant daughter after some trouble Finch would not name outright, sheltered under Edmund's protection, while a more permanent arrangement was built for her outside the county. She had been, Finch said, a woman of considerable spirit, quick to laugh, quicker still to argue, and Edmund had visited more often than propriety allowed, though Finch was careful to say he had seen nothing improper with his own eyes, only heard raised voices through the cottage wall on the night before she left for France for good. He did not know what the quarrel concerned. He knew only that Cecile Duval had gone within the week, that Edmund had ridden out after her and returned 3 days later looking, in Finch's words, like a man who had buried someone, and that no one at Rothmere had spoken her name aloud again in the 11 years since. Julian asked whether the daughter had gone with her mother, and Finch said yes, a girl of perhaps 4 or 5 at the time, dark-haired like her mother, and that he remembered nothing more particular than that, since children were not his business, and he had been paid well not to make them so. Margaret watched Julian's face carefully as he absorbed this, the careful stillness he wore over what she now recognized as genuine feeling, and she understood that whatever quarrel had ended his father's long devotion, it had ended it entirely, and violently enough that a man did not speak of it again for the rest of his life. The rain began as they made their farewells to Finch, a thin, persistent rain that thickened within the half-hour into something the coachman judged unsafe for the narrow track back to Rothmere, the road already softening toward the ruts that had swallowed carriage wheels before in worse seasons. Finch offered his own roof without much ceremony, apologizing for its plainness, and Julian accepted before Margaret could object, on grounds of propriety that seemed, in the face of genuine weather, almost foolish to raise. The cottage held only 2 rooms besides the kitchen, and Finch retired early to the smaller of them, leaving Julian and Margaret to the kitchen fire, the rain drumming steady against a single small window, the 2 of them seated on opposite sides of a table scarred by decades of a working man's knife and mug. For a long while neither spoke, the silence comfortable rather than strained, the kind that grows between 2 people who have spent enough consecutive days together that speech is no longer required to fill every gap. It was Julian who broke it, not with a question about his father or the letters, but with something smaller, more private, asked in a voice stripped of the flatness he used at Rothmere. He asked how she had come to read French at all, given what her family had always claimed of her, and he asked it gently, as a man asks something he has wondered about for weeks but has not felt entitled to demand. Margaret found, to her own surprise, that she wanted to tell him. She said her father had been a country vicar, plain living and poor in everything but books, and that he had taught her himself, English first and then Latin and then French, sitting her on his knee before she could properly hold a pen and having her repeat words after him, as other fathers might teach a child a nursery rhyme. She told him her father had believed, unfashionably for a man of his position, that a clever mind wasted itself in silence, and that he had meant to see her properly educated, a governess perhaps, or schooling beyond what he could give her himself, before a fever took him in the same season it left her, at 7 years old, an orphan in her aunt's house. She said the reading had simply stayed with her afterward, the way a language learned early stays in the mouth long after the person who taught it is gone, an inheritance no one could see, and so no one had ever been able to take from her, though she stopped there, her hands folding together in her lap in the old, careful gesture, and did not go on to say what her aunt had done the day she was discovered using it. And Julian, watching her face change in the firelight, did not ask, though he understood, without being told, that there was more to the silence than grief alone. The return to Fenwick Cross took less than an hour by carriage, but Margaret felt the distance between the steward's cottage and her aunt's front hall as something far greater, a passage from one version of herself back into another she had thought, for one rain-locked night, she might be permitted to leave behind. Constance was waiting at the door before the horses had fully stopped, her shawl clutched at her throat in a way that Margaret recognized from childhood as the posture of a woman assembling her fury in advance. There had been no note sent ahead, no warning of a delay, only silence since the previous afternoon, and silence from Margaret had always, in this house, been read as guilt. Constance did not ask where she had been, she had already decided. The words came before Margaret had crossed the threshold, low and precise, meant for Margaret alone, though Louisa hovered visibly in the passage behind her mother, ostensibly arranging flowers that did not need arranging. A night away from any decent household, Constance said, spent under a stranger's roof with a man, unmarried and unrelated to her, was not the sort of thing that could be smoothed over with an explanation about weather and washed-out roads. She said the word ruined the way another woman might have said dead, final and without appeal, and she said it twice, as though repetition might make Margaret feel its weight more completely. Margaret had rehearsed calm on the ride home, had told herself she would meet whatever waited for her without flinching, and she found, standing in the hall with rain still drying in the folds of her cloak, that the calm held. She said the delay had been unavoidable, that Mr. Finch himself could confirm the state of the road, that nothing had occurred which required either of them to speak of ruin. Constance's mouth thinned at being contradicted in her own hall, a thing Margaret had not done in 19 years, not once, not even when the accusations were smaller and easier to bear. Then abandon the work, Constance said, as though granting a mercy. Send word to the hall tomorrow that you are needed at home, that your health does not permit further travel, and this will end here, quietly, before anyone beyond this house need think of it again. It was, Margaret understood, not a punishment but an offer, the last one Constance intended to make, and it was meant to be accepted gratefully, the way all of Constance's offers had been accepted for 19 years. Margaret did not accept it. The refusal left her before she had fully decided to give it, quiet but entire, and she watched it land on her aunt's face as something closer to shock than anger, as though the furniture of the house had spoken back. She said she would return to Rothmere Hall in the morning as arranged, that the Duke's household expected her, and that she saw no reason to abandon honest work for the sake of gossip that had not yet been proven to exist outside this hall. Constance's composure, so carefully worn for 19 years, slipped then, not into rage exactly, but into something colder and more desperate, the look of a woman watching a debt come due that she had never expected to be called to pay. She turned to the small gathering that had assembled without Margaret quite noticing, Louisa abandoning her flowers, a maid pausing with a coal scuttle in the passage, her uncle appearing in his study doorway drawn by the raised voices, and she said, loudly enough to be certain of her audience, that perhaps it was time the household understood exactly what sort of gratitude Margaret's cleverness deserved. She said Margaret's own father, dead 19 years, had left a sealed paper with the family solicitor before he died, a paper Constance had always assumed concerned some small debt or a request for a mourning ring, worthless enough that no one had ever troubled to retrieve it. She said this now, she told the room, only so that everyone might see how little Margaret's people had thought of her even then, a paper nobody wanted badly enough to collect in 19 years. It was meant, Margaret understood even as the words struck her, to be a final humiliation, one more proof that she had always been unwanted, unclaimed, beneath the trouble of retrieval. But Margaret felt something else entirely move through her, sudden and complete, a certainty she could not yet explain even to herself. Her father had left nothing carelessly in his life. He had taught her Latin before she could write her own name properly, had corrected her French conjugations by candlelight with the patience of a man who believed his daughter's mind was worth the hours he spent on it. A man like that did not leave a sealed paper behind out of idle habit. Margaret asked, her voice steadier than she felt, what the paper said, and Constance, already regretting the disclosure, said she had never read it, had never cared to, and did not know. That night, before she allowed herself to sleep, Margaret wrote to Mr. Price by candlelight, asking him plainly to find her father's sealed paper and tell her, whatever it held, the whole of it, though she could not say, sealing the letter, whether 19 years had left it worth finding at all. Mr. Price's office smelled of dust and binding leather, the same smell Margaret remembered from a single childhood visit she had not understood at the time, brought along while her father settled some parish matter she had been too young to follow. The solicitor was an old man now, spectacles thick, hands spotted with age, and he received her letter with the mild confusion of someone asked to recall a promise made across a distance of decades. He did remember the name Ashcombe, he said, turning slowly through a locked drawer of papers arranged by year rather than by family, murmuring dates to himself, and Margaret stood very still, aware that she was holding her breath in a way that made the room seem too small. When he found it, he held it for a moment without opening it, turning it over to note the seal, unbroken, her father's own hand on the outer fold naming his daughter Margaret, in a script she recognized instantly, the same hand that had once guided hers over a Latin primer. Mr. Price read it first to himself, his brow drawing down, and then looked at her with an expression she could not immediately name, something between apology and astonishment. He read it aloud at her request, his voice dry and careful over words her father had written the week before his death, that his daughter Margaret had, by his own instruction, been taught to read and write English competently, and Latin and French besides, at an age and to a degree unusual for a girl of her station, and that should anything befall him before she came of age, he wished it recorded formally that she be given the education of a young gentlewoman, a governess if the household's means allowed it, so that the learning he had given her with his own hands might be carried forward rather than lost. He had named Constance and her husband as the intended guardians of this instruction. He had trusted them to carry it out. Margaret sat in the hard chair opposite Mr. Price's desk and found she could not speak for a long moment, the paper's existence alone rearranging 19 years into a shape she had never been permitted to see. Proof, not merely that she could read, but that her father had known it, had planned for it, had wanted the whole world to know it too, and had been quietly, completely disobeyed by the one person entrusted with his wishes. She told Julian everything that same evening, in the Rothmere study where the 41 letters still lay in their careful stacks, because there was no longer any reason left to withhold it, and because he was, she understood only as she began speaking, the first person in 19 years she trusted to hear it without using it against her. She told him of the psalm she had copied out at 12 to entertain a cousin too ill to read for herself, the careful French verses she had been so proud of, and of her aunt discovering the pages before the cousin ever saw them. She told him what Constance had done that afternoon, burned the pages in the kitchen grate herself, standing over the fire until they were entirely gone, and what she had said afterward, that Margaret would repeat the demonstration to no one, ever, on pain of being turned out with nothing, into a world that had no place for a penniless orphan, with no family name to soften her circumstances. She told him 19 years of ledgers corrected by candlelight, letters written in Constance's name and Constance's hand copied over her own drafts, mending and management given without a wage and without thanks, all of it built on a threat renewed silently every single day, simply by being unspoken, needing no repetition because Margaret had never once tested whether it would be carried out. Julian listened without interrupting her, his stillness deepening rather than easing as she spoke, and when she finished, he did not offer the outrage she had half expected. No raised voice, no immediate vow of vengeance spoken for effect. He asked only, after a long silence, whether the codicil was safe, and when she said it remained with Mr. Price, he nodded once, as a man nods at the confirmation of a fact he intends to act upon rather than merely feel. He told her, in the same level voice he used for estate matters, that Constance Ashcombe would answer for what she had done, but not quietly, and not on Constance's terms, not in some private correction offered and accepted behind closed doors, where the truth could still be managed and softened afterward into a family misunderstanding. He said it would happen where the lie had been told for 19 years, in front of the same people who had believed it. Margaret asked what he intended to do. He did not fully answer her. He rose, called for his horse to be saddled despite the hour and the distance, and left her standing alone among her father's borrowed proof and the old Duke's letters, with no way of knowing, as the sound of hooves faded down the gravel drive into the dark, what Julian Varel meant to say to her aunt, or how far he meant to take it before the night was through. The Fenwick Cross Assembly Room filled early for the autumn gathering, candles lit in every sconce until the plastered walls glowed the color of weak tea, and the same families who had spent 19 years believing one thing about Margaret Ashcombe arranged themselves in their usual clusters near the long windows. Constance arrived in her best gray silk, Louisa beside her in blue, both women composed in the particular way of people who had rehearsed their composure in a looking-glass beforehand. Julian entered without ceremony, no footman announcing him, simply the room's noise dropping by half as heads turned and turned again, and Margaret was not yet among them, still delayed at Price's office finishing a letter she did not know would matter within the hour. Julian crossed the floor directly to where Constance stood accepting compliments on Louisa's gown, and he did not lower his voice to a register meant only for her. He asked, in the same tone he used to question a steward's accounts, whether she recalled a codicil left with Mr. Thomas Price some 19 years past by the Reverend Charles Ashcombe. Constance's smile did not immediately fail her. She said she recalled no such document, that her late brother-in-law had left nothing of consequence beyond debts and a motherless child, and that she could not account for whatever rumor had reached the Duke's ears. Julian withdrew the codicil itself from inside his coat, unfolded it without haste, and read aloud the single line that named Margaret's education as her father's explicit wish, delivered in a voice pitched to carry to the doorway and the musicians' gallery both. The room, which had been murmuring, went still in the particular way a room goes still when it senses it is about to be handed something true. Constance's composure did not shatter so much as thin, like ice under a boot that has not yet cracked but will. She said the document must be a forgery or a misunderstanding, that she had never in her life been shown such a paper, and Julian answered only that Mr. Price would confirm its provenance to anyone present who cared to ask him directly, since the solicitor stood not 10 feet away near the refreshment table, having been invited for precisely this purpose. Price inclined his head once, gravely, confirming the seal and the hand and the date without being asked a second time. Louisa's eyes moved from her mother to the Duke and back again, calculating, the way she had once calculated Margaret's usefulness at the mending basket, only now the sum was coming out wrong for her own family, and she knew it before her mother did. Constance tried once more to right herself, turning to the room rather than to Julian, appealing to the neighbors who had dined at her table and heard her speak for 19 years of her poor, afflicted niece, the fever-touched girl who could not be expected to read a hymnal, let alone a letter. She said she had only ever done her Christian duty by a child left with nothing, that whatever paper Mr. Price held meant nothing beside the plain fact everyone in the room had witnessed with their own eyes for 2 decades. It was then that Mrs. Prudence Hale stepped forward from where she had been standing near the doorway with 2 of the Rothmere maids, not summoned, not rehearsed, simply unwilling to let a plain fact be spoken that was not true. She said, in the flat, unadorned voice of a woman who managed accounts and expected to be believed on the strength of them, that she herself had been engaged 19 years before to help clear the old Ashcombe nursery after the Reverend's death, and that she had been instructed by Mrs. Ashcombe personally to remove a box of French and Latin primers to the attic and never to speak of them again, as they belonged to a foolishness better forgotten. She said she had thought little of it at the time, being a young housemaid with no cause to question her mistress, but that she had never forgotten packing away books plainly marked in a child's careful hand with the name Margaret Ashcombe on the flyleaf of each one. The room's stillness changed character entirely at that, no longer merely attentive but faintly appalled, the particular hush of people realizing they have applauded a cruelty for years without knowing its name. Constance opened her mouth and found nothing further to offer it, her silk skirts suddenly looking less like elegance and more like armor, with the seams showing. Louisa, who had spent the evening standing close enough to her mother to share credit for the family's standing, took one visible step backward, putting air between herself and Constance in front of the very people whose opinion she had always courted, murmuring to a nearby acquaintance that she had never herself believed the old story, that she had always found her cousin cleverer than she let on, a claim so plainly invented in that moment that it convinced no one but marked, unmistakably, which way she meant to jump. It was into this room, silent and reordering itself around a truth it had just been forced to hold, that Margaret finally entered, breathless from the walk from Price's office, still in her plain gray cloak, utterly unaware of what had already been said in the quarter hour before her arrival, and finding every face in the room turned toward the door to look at her. The room did not laugh at Margaret that night, nor whisper behind gloved hands as it once had, and the difference struck her before she understood its cause, a silence that held instead of mocked, until Mrs. Hale began to clap, quietly at first and then joined by the curate Louisa had once mocked her in front of, and then by others who had simply been waiting for permission to admit what they already half believed. Julian crossed to her through the parting crowd and did not explain what had happened, only handed her the last untranslated page from his father's 41 letters, the one naming a girl in France he had learned to think of as his sister, and asked her, before the room, to read it aloud in her own voice rather than his borrowed understanding of it. Margaret's hands did not shake as she unfolded it. She read Edmond Varel's final words to Cecile Duval, written in French 18 months before his death, a plain accounting of love interrupted by pride and distance, and a quarrel he had never found the courage to mend, and a promise, unfulfilled in his lifetime, that his daughter would want for nothing and would one day be acknowledged under his name. The room heard it in English from Margaret's mouth, and heard also, though no one said so aloud, that the same family who had called her simple had just watched her hand a dead duke's confession to his living son. In the weeks after, Julian wrote to Rouen himself, with Margaret beside him rendering every reply, and by the new year, Cecile Duval's daughter, now a young woman of 21 named Aimée, crossed the channel to Rothmere Hall to be received not as a secret, but as a sister, given rooms in the East Wing and a place at the family table that no one in the county thought to question, since the Duke himself had made the acknowledgement plainly and would brook no comment on it twice. Constance's household did not recover its former standing. Invitations that had once come freely to her table grew infrequent and then stopped, and she was seen at fewer gatherings, her name spoken with the particular politeness reserved for those a room has quietly finished with. Louisa, finding no advantage left in her mother's favor, accepted within the year a modest offer from a tradesman's son in Fenwick Cross, a match Constance would once have called beneath her, and made it without a single word of objection, since objection required a standing she no longer possessed. Julian and Margaret were married quietly at the Fenwick Cross Church in March of 1820, the ceremony small by the standards of a dukedom, attended by Mrs. Hale in her best bonnet, by Mr. Price with the Codicil's twin copy kept for the parish register, and by Amy, who stood nearer the front than any distant Ashcombe cousin was offered. Margaret asked for no jewels and no new gown beyond what practicality required, requesting instead that her father's old French primer, its cover long since worn soft at the corners, be rebound in leather as her wedding gift, and Julian had it done by a bookbinder in Salisbury, who did not ask why a duchess wanted so plain a thing treated with such care. In the months that followed, the house at Rothmere settled into a rhythm neither Margaret nor Julian had known before, one built on work shared rather than work hidden, and Margaret returned often to the study desk where Julian had first tested her with a single page, now piled with estate correspondence she managed openly, in her own hand, under her own name. It was there, on a gray afternoon in early spring with rain streaking the tall windows the way it had the night at the Steward's cottage, that Margaret sat with Amy beside her, the rebound primer open between them, guiding the younger woman's finger beneath a line of French verbs the way Reverend Ashcombe had once guided her own hand at a kitchen table she could still remember, despite the fever that had never actually touched her mind at all. Amy stumbled over a conjugation and laughed at herself without embarrassment, the easy laugh of someone who has never been told that reading was a danger rather than a gift, and Margaret corrected her gently, the same patient correction her father had once given a frightened 7-year-old who did not yet know what she was being handed. Neither woman heard Julian's step in the corridor. He stood in the study doorway a long moment without announcing himself, watching his wife's dark head bent beside his sister's fair one over the same worn primer, the desk between them scattered with translated letters and household ledgers, and a French psalm copied out fresh in a hand no one would ever again claim could not write it. And he said nothing to interrupt them, content simply to watch the room hold what it had once denied her the right to have.